Dr. Mark Changizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about centralized social credit systems like they have in China and effectively what they surely probably have here in social media. Now, what the idea about a centralized social credit system is that the government or some central organization, potentially urged by the government, keeps track of each of our social reputations in some sense. Now, this undermines completely the very notion of what a social credit system is. A social credit system, the entire idea behind it is that in a social network, we acquire reputations by virtue of all the kinds of interactions we have, debates, arguments, disagreements, compromises, how right we tend to be, how morally right and factually right we tend to be, how annoying we are and aggressive and dramatic we are when we're disagreeing versus how fair we are. All of these things are included in our judgments about the reputation of someone. People can be very sweet and nice and like the chipmunks and always being very nice and slowly accumulate over time. And some people could be very aggressive and douchebaggy and make very strong dramatic claims, but then thereby bet a lot of reputation during a disagreement and thereby lose it all once they're found out to be wrong. They lose a lot more being wrong after you've been dramatic. So as we've talked about, these concern emotional expressions. They concern the arguments between people, and it's at the network level, not at the individual pairs level, that ultimately the truth is discovered by these complex market of ideas. Now, and it's through that people acquire reputations. They acquire reputations through this whole process. And where is it that those reputations are known? There's no central location in the social network, whether it's at Twitter or whether it's real life social networks. There's no location where you can go check whose reputations are what. It's distributed amongst the heads of everybody in the social community. It's in each of their brains, and it's in the connectivity of the entire network. So you could destroy it in two ways. You could suddenly mix everybody up such they can't interact with the same folks they do. So they've got these memories, but they're never interacting with the same folks. You can mess up the memory in that sense, or you can just get rid of people's memories of certain folks. If that were to happen, then you'd also ruin the society level or the network level memory of where the reputations are. But it's inherently decentralized, and that's good. So one of the reasons it's good is because the state and no centralized, powerful organization can just take some centralized list of reputations and modulate them on the basis of their interests, right? You can't go head to head in all of the millions of heads and modulate the reputations. It's stored in all of their heads. This is just like very similar to a blockchain. The reason that we want cryptocurrency is the idea is that rather than our financial currency transactions occurring in some centralized location at some credit card company, which could be controlled and manipulated and confiscated by the government, it's instead recorded on hundreds of thousands or millions of computers in a distributed manner. Nobody has the ability to go muck with all of those computers and change who was sent this much Bitcoin at which time. And over time, there's then a ledger, a history on the blockchain of all the different kinds of transactions that occurred. And those are also listed on all those computers. You can't change them all. And it's very hard for some mathematical reasons to go modulate the entire narrative of the history of the financial transactions for cryptocurrency, in the same way that it's very difficult for these social networks, once they've developed a narrative that encapsulates the changes of reputation, who rose and who fell in reputation by virtue of their actions. These narratives get built, these sort of nice stories that summarize these things, and they become really hard to change. And that's good because you don't want them to be changeable by powerful forces. You want them to be very hard to change. You want to preserve the societal memory. There's bad sides to it because if it makes a mistake, it's really hard to go back and undo these narratives when they have bad ideas in them. They're really hard. But it's good because the state makes it very hard for the state to go muck with the narrative. So, of course, the state can muck with the narrative by just banning voices altogether. Centralized censorship is why that can undermine all of these mechanisms, right? But even worse is that if in addition to centralized censorship, we had centralized social credit systems where we just ignored the reputations that are in the heads across the entire network of humans, and everything was just concerned the centralized credit score, the centralized reputation score. Well, then they can just muck and change and decide who's going to be high reputation and who's not. So some people have thought, like, hey, let's put Twitter on the blockchain. And Twitter itself had announced that they're going to work on things like that. And Minds.com is apparently a social network which is on the blockchain. So it's impervious in some sense to being mucked with. There's no way that the government can come in and start to push certain voices down. But really, and that's important, but don't get confused into thinking that that it's that kind of decentralization of having all of the history of posts and all of the network of interactions occurring in a decentralized manner, that's the same thing as a decentralized social credit score, right? Because you could still have the federal government coming along and looking at the decentralized posts on Minds.com and then coming up with some kind of centralized social credit score on the basis of that. And then just posting that someplace, and it's being used to allow you into certain restaurants, allowing whether you can keep a certain job or get a certain job and so forth. The key to social credit scores is that they themselves are decentralized, not on people's computers, but that they're out in the heads of humans. That's the key to reputation and the way that it functions, so that it's safe from prying powerful folks, is that it's distributed across minds, not distributed across computers, distributed across minds. And so to help you see that it really is distributed across minds, consider Getter. Now, when Getter came out, it's one of these social media platforms that's competing with Gab and Parler and Truth Social, all competing with Twitter, because Twitter, and the reason that they exist at all, by the way, is because Twitter was being unreasonably censorial, right? So Getter had this advertisement that said, "Hey, come to Getter and we'll keep all of your followers and reproduce them, your Twitter followers, and reproduce them at Getter." And even a cursory thinking about this, you say, that doesn't make sense. They can't do that. They don't even know which followers you have from Getter. So how can they reproduce them? And it turns out, of course, they can't do that. All that they do is they look into Twitter and they just check how many followers you have, and they kind of just say how many followers you have, and it makes you look cool in Getter, even though you have no Getter followers. You look like a big shot because you've got a lot of Twitter followers. But the reason that they mention that, the reason that they try to look as if they're somehow maintaining is that because only by bringing all of your followers with you over there does your reputation go with you. And it's not really just that. It's not just bringing your followers, but bringing the connected. They still have to be your followers, and you still have to be following the other people. And they have to be, all of the network has to be there, and all of their memories. So if they come over, it really has to be the same people with the same memories, sharing the same narrative of what happened over the last 2 years or 10 years, where they've remembered that, in that narrative, Doug is just really cool, and I want to listen to what Doug says. And Susie's always right about medical stuff, and so forth. They have these specific memories and narratives that help them remember these things and help the community remember them. But it only gets transferred when the people get transferred with their memories intact, and the network structure amongst those people gets transferred. That's just to help sort of prove to yourself that, that's where reputations lie. That's where the entire history of all the bad and good things that the network has said through all of this chaos gets fixed in these different reputations. And the reputations are remembered in the heads of other people. And they're remembered in the heads of other people because there's a long storyline about the history of the things that happened in the network, like a gossip, which is like a blockchain, which keeps those memories. All of those things come with it. When the people, were they to all suddenly go together, then you'd have it intact. Of course, as we've talked about before, you can't get everybody to move from one social media to another. It's very avalanche-like and hard to force to happen. But the thought experiment helps show you that the nature of reputation is that it's decentralized in a very similar manner as blockchain, but it has to be in the heads of individuals, not on computers per se. And that was your science moment.